It was set in the middle of the famine in Ukraine. She's going to be telling us what she makes of what's going on there at the moment and why the Ukrainian psyche is quite the way that it is. Also, Fraser Nelson will be telling us why he thinks that the COVID modelers should be an absolute and utter thing of the past, why they should not ever be allowed anywhere near predicting what is going to happen in the future of this country, because quite frankly all of the investigations that we're going to be doing over the course of the next few months are going to reveal that an awful lot of people did an awful lot of things which they should not have done, and the modelers themselves are to blame for all of that. We're going to be looking at a new report that's come out. Even the modelers are saying they got it completely wrong. Even they don't think they should be allowed back into Downing Street, and I would have to say I agree with them. 0344 499 1000 is the number. This is Talk Radio.
The Independent Republic of Mike Graham on Talk Radio.
Got Mark from Sunbury here. He says, Mike, what has happened to Ukraine is proof positive that the West arming itself with nuclear weapons in the past and now was and is the correct thing to do. CND needs supporters and they need to hang their heads in shame. Well, I think that's probably correct, because if we did not have nuclear weapons, perhaps things would be an awful lot worse in Ukraine. But let's talk to Helen Dale, who is, of course, commentator, author, lawyer as well. Helen, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike.
Now,
good to see you again.
Well, indeed, it feels like a long time, doesn't it? I mean,
you went on holiday.
Well, I went on a mission of mercy, shall we say. It wasn't so much a holiday as a family trip to see my mother, who is about to be 98, would you believe? And,
good grief, well done.
Is in very good shape, and I fully expect her to reach 100 and get a telegram from the Queen. But that's
Excellent.
Another story.
You get a card. One of my relatives got to the century, and she got a card, a signed card, with a picture of the Queen on it.
Very nice. Well, absolutely. You're looking forward to that. I mean, who knew when you wrote your rather controversial book way back when that Ukraine would suddenly become the centre of the universe, which is kind of what it is at the moment?
And also the experience of having all the things that basically I said in 1994 when the book first came out, and 1995, now being accepted across the sort of Western alliance, across NATO, the European Union, the UK, the US, has been quite a shock to the system. I mean, I'm not quite sure whether I have fully processed this shift, because in 1995, during the publicity, it might have been 1994, during the publicity for the book, which I shall hold up, because you can buy it from the shops, Inevitable Author, The Hand That Signed the Paper, by me.
Yes.
And it came out in 1994, I said in an Australian chat show that one day Russia would attempt to retake Ukraine, because it has always considered Ukraine to be part of Russia. It's very much like China and Taiwan, or China and Hong Kong, or Tibet. So this is why the conflict is so brutal, and it is why it is so intractable, and it is why Putin has told so many lies to his own people about there being a genocide going on in Ukraine in order to justify it, because this is older than communism. It is older than all of the things that you associate with the Soviet Union and the Cold War, although it's manifesting now, as your previous caller pointed out about the nuclear issue and mutually assured destruction. It's looking Cold War-ish, but the actual issue is older than the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And to the extent, and I think it's worth doing this, you can get the text, and a fairly good English translations, you don't need to know Russian or Ukrainian, of Putin's speech he made a few days before he invaded. And the essence of this speech is basically Vladimir Putin arguing with a ghost. He is arguing with the version of Ukraine that existed in 1941 when the Nazis invaded. And there was, and I am completely frank about this in The Hand That Signed the Paper, because of what had happened in 1932 and 1933, where something like 5 million Ukrainians were starved to death in what Ukrainians call the Holodomor, which is extermination by starvation. So basically any port in a storm, quite a lot of Ukrainians did indeed welcome the Germans, particularly in West Ukraine, into their country, because they thought nothing could be as bad as Soviet communism. So there were Ukrainian fascists, there were collaborators. This is a true thing that happened, and it's all in my book.
Yes, I mean, to
So
be
is
fair,
the
the same thing was the
So-
case. The same thing was the case in what is now Croatia, and when Croatia
yes,
when Croatia was recognised by the United Nations as the first kind of former Yugoslavian entity to get independence, you know, that kicked off the Balkans War, kicked off the Bosnian War. But nobody said at the time, "Oh, we shouldn't give them independence purely and simply because they were on the Nazi side during the Second World War."
Well, no, and this is exactly the point with Ukraine. And the other thing that has happened is that those parts of the country that you might think would be more historically inclined to have negative memories, not only of communism as a result of the Holodomor, but also of Nazism, because the Nazi occupation, if you sort of visualize Ukraine, which kind of looks like a rectangle in your head with the Crimea hanging off the bottom of it, basically the Nazis behaved appallingly like they always did everywhere across the entire country. But it got worse as they went across it. So much so that in Kharkiv, the city you've been hearing about a lot in the news, the second city of Ukraine, which is in East Ukraine, they started another mini famine. You know, so there was this dreadful communist one that happened in 1932 and 1933, which killed about 5 million people. And then the Nazis managed to start up another one that was only basically stopped, you know, another 500,000 people. And these are huge numbers about this country managed to die off because of the Nazi behaviour. But what has happened is because Putin has told himself and the Russian people, you know, he's arguing with this version of Ukraine that no longer exists. They are fighting heroically as well because they just don't want to be conquered. And the logic of this is really very simple. Austrians speak German. That doesn't make them German.
No.
Just because there are ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in East Ukraine, as there are, and there have been for many of them were moved there in the late 19th century and then again under Stalin, and I can explain that history if you like as well. That does not mean that they are in Putin's pocket.
Right.
They're their own people with their own minds.
Well, there are plenty of people in Russia who are not in Putin's pocket. We've seen them demonstrating outside various public buildings. We've seen them getting arrested for putting flowers down. I mean, I saw yesterday pictures from that bridge in Moscow where one of Putin's enemies was assassinated a few years back, where loads and loads of people have been putting flowers down. So it's very much being seen, even in Russia, I think, as Putin's war rather than Russia's war.
I think it is probably fair to say that at the moment, this is very contingent, Putin does still have the support of the majority of the Russian people in Russia itself. But that support will ebb if there are many more casualties.
I also wonder about their resilience when it comes to the availability of goods and services and money, because obviously my daughter actually was in Moscow until yesterday, and she was saying that, you know, nobody can get a credit card put through, all of that stopped. Visa and MasterCard are not operational. You know, Apple Pay is not working. People are finding it very difficult to buy things. They're running out of stuff. And as soon as that starts to hit the ordinary man and woman in the street, I think they'll start to feel as though this is unnecessary.
Well, the regime of sanctions, for me, in terms of seeing that the intensity of the sanctions, although there are still quite serious flaws in the sanctions regime, mainly produced by Germany's reliance on Russian oil and gas, absolutely criminal stupidity to shut down their nuclear power plants, criminal stupidity. So there are flaws in the sanctions, but the overall intensity of them, and particularly the intensity that is coming from the City of London, very impressively, and interestingly as well, the French Navy with maritime issues, is the parallel for me is to compare the sanctions regime that was directed against South Africa. And eventually that brought down the South African government, those sanctions did. They just could not hold out any longer. And the thing is, world markets are more integrated now. So financial markets type sanctions can basically mean you finish up with a situation where the government can no longer pay its civil servants and can no longer pay its army and that kind of thing, because it literally runs out of money.
Right.
Or it just turns into hyperinflation.
Well, that's right. And I mean, I think that is, I mean, in some ways, and this argument has been made to me by others, that also some of the oligarchs are not going to be too keen on having all their wealth taken away from them and all their yachts confiscated and all their houses in places like London and Milan and Paris being made off limits to them. They're going to say, hang on a minute, you know, we don't want to be pariahs of the world. We want to enjoy the fruits of somebody else's labours, whoever it was that gave it to them.
That's also another point you've just raising that made me think of two things. Your first was a joke I saw this morning that which is more expensive, Chelsea Football Club or a full tank of fuel? Who wants it?
Well, I mean, it depends on the going rate, doesn't it? I suppose is a straight answer to that.
And the other thing is that another reason why there is strong resistance to the Russian invasion in East Ukraine, despite the fact that these people are Russian-speaking and are ethnically Russian, is they can see that they are more prosperous, and they have been more prosperous probably for the last decade than the people over the border in the autonomous republics, which is the disputed territories, Luhansk and Donetsk and that area.
Right.
So they can see that. People have eyes. They can see that and I'm not pretending that Ukraine has not had serious problems with political corruption. That's why they've had coups. That's why they've had internal fights. And in this context, it needs to be remembered that Zelensky was only elected in 2019. And like everybody else who went through an election year in 2019, Boris Johnson is another good example, and even Scott Morrison in Australia, he's had no opportunity to implement any of his manifesto promises because of COVID. Because the whole, everything turned into COVID. So there's that as well.
Well, there is. And I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, how quickly that has disappeared off the face of the earth. Now there's actually a proper emergency going on.
Well, yes, I did see a very smart remark from someone on Twitter, and I won't dob them in, but it was along the lines of, do we give Putin the Nobel Prize for Medicine for finding a cure to COVID?
Yes, I mean, that's amongst many other things. I mean, you've written an article recently as well, Helen, about the West needing to wise up. And I wonder about the timing of all of this, as many people have. Vladimir Putin looks at NATO, looks at the EU, looks at the United States, looks at the White House, Joe Biden, sees nothing really there to stop him from doing whatever he wants.
Well, this is the other thing. When my book first came out in Australia, in The Hand That Signed the Paper, when it was first published, and people laughed at me when I said, well, one day Russia will try to reconquer it. And they all said, oh, that's not going to happen. Look, communism just fell over. Yeah. And they didn't understand that communism greatly weakened what should be a world power.
Yeah.
I mean, because communist and Marxist economics don't work. They're not.
No. No, but perversely, the reason that if it was to be described as communism is coming back is purely and simply because of capitalism, because of all the money that Putin's been making in the sale of his gas.
Oh yes, he's the only reason he can afford to do this is because oil prices are sky high and everybody wants Russia's gas, and he's been busily in oil, and it's not just gas; it is oil as well. But the point then was people laughed at Russia in 1994 and 1995, but Russia was weak. Now, there are still serious issues with the Russian economy. To give you an idea, the economy of the United Kingdom is twice the size of the economy of Russia. Yeah. The economy of the European Union, excluding the United Kingdom, is 9 times the size of Russia. So there are still serious problems there, but it's a lot wealthier than it was in 1995. So Russia waited till it was strong, and also when it had someone who really doesn't believe, and this is the point that I was making in my piece for CapX that was published on Monday, he just doesn't believe in the same things as us. Now, he can still be a very bad person, and I believe he is, but he's not a carpet-biting nutter.
No.
And I had to say that in the piece.
No, I agree with you. I don't think
this
there's
is a rational way to behave.
Of course he does. And then anyone who's had anything to do with Russian industry or Russian individuals would know that. And I find it extraordinary that anybody who is supposedly being taken seriously as a politician would make out that he is crazy, because that, one, doesn't help the argument, and two, is completely and utterly off the scale mad.
About the only thing I can comment on with Putin's eccentric public behaviour is it occurs in one area. He's clearly got really bad COVID paranoia, which is why he's putting all the other delegates way down the other end of the table, and why he had Macron at the other end of the table and it looked like a seesaw and that kind of these enormous things.
But you do have to ask the question, don't you, Helen? I mean, if he's that paranoid about it, why is he even meeting them? Why doesn't he just do it on Zoom?
This is true. This is also
a
completely fair point.
Is it a bit of theatre?
It could be just theatre.
Yeah.
It could just be theatre.
Because he can. But, he's a guy who likes to show that he's powerful. There's no good being powerful unless you can show it.
But just on your earlier point about the Ukrainian psyche as a result of what happened in the famine in the 30s, and then this utterly brutal Nazi occupation where at least some of them thought, oh, things might get better, and they didn't. That kind of thing. People continuing to die, and there are hundreds and thousands and millions to be slaughtered and so on and so forth. What it's done is it's produced a nation of survivors, people who are really very, very hardy. And the analogy to me, the closest analogy, is there's two things going on. They've managed to keep the toughness and survivability and drop the negative trait in their culture. And I'll try to put this as simply as possible. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Ukraine in 1941. It's why you got collaboration. They blamed the Jewish people for communism, basically. And they blamed Russians for it as well. But a large percentage of a small group means that small group is at a lot more risk in the case of the Jews than a small percentage of a large group, lots and lots of Russians, basically. The Jews were in terrible danger. And when Putin is arguing with this 1941 ghost of Ukraine and trying to call them fascists and anti-Semites, the Ukrainians have elected a Jewish president. Anti-Semitism in Ukraine is over.
Yes.
If the values of the people, particularly in West Ukraine, where the bulk of Zelensky's support comes from, is very popular there, still had the same values and attitudes that Putin tries to claim that they do, he would not have had a shout at being elected president of Ukraine. He got 73% of the vote. The far right or far left, far weird, if you want to call them in Ukraine, the far out people, the kind of people who would have perpetrated massacres in 1941, like the Babyn massacre that has been in the news so much, they got 2% of the vote. Yeah. So I think Ukrainians get to say, no, we've put that history behind us.
Well, there are plenty of countries, many of them in Eastern Europe, that have far-right and far-left parties. You know, Ukraine is not alone in that.
No,
and neither is it particularly specially sort of upholstered with loads of people who think like that.
Not at all. I mean, it is particularly the Western part of it, and it is important to remember that those electoral maps that basically chop it in two and show one half yellow and one half blue, I mean, it's done colour code with the flag,
yes.
And one side is much more Russian than the other. That does have significance. The people in West Ukraine are different. They're not just ethnically different, sort of ethnicity. They're often a different religion. Yeah. They have a different kind of orthodoxy. They have a distinctive local variety of Ukrainian Orthodox, and they also have a distinctive variety of local Catholicism. The city Lviv, where the cat cafe is, which has been reported a lot in the news and stayed open because they couldn't run away, because otherwise who would feed the cats? Now that city is overwhelmingly Catholic. Yeah. And you might think, oh, Roman Catholic, it's like Spain or it's like Italy. No, it's Ukrainian Catholic and Ukrainian Uniate, or Greek Catholic it's sometimes called. And to give you an idea of how different it is, the priests are allowed to marry.
Really?
So yes, this is a very distinctive and unusual culture. And if ever the Russians are chased out, and I hope it happens, but it's one of those things where you hope but can't expect. Yeah. I mean, I last was in Lviv in 2015. It is one of the most beautiful cities, and the Catholic cathedral is glorious. Yeah.
Well, this is the thing, and this is why I'm saying to people to try and get their heads around what's actually going on, because I think a lot of people can't quite figure it out, is that it's a bit like waking up in any city in Western Europe to find that there are Russian troops walking around shooting people and blowing up buildings. You know, it's that weird.
Well, yeah, this is the thing. When you see I've had friends of mine observing when the refugee exodus the women and children started to leave Kiev. People were going, friends of mine were going, my goodness, they're all in Audis and Mercedes and BMWs. Right. Jaguars and I'm going, you have to understand that if you take the burden of communism off of Ukrainians, they are very entrepreneurial people. One of the reasons why they were persecuted during the Ukrainian famine and why the slaughter was so ethnically intensely, the Soviets killed lots of people, but why it was such an intense persecution of Ukrainians is because they were very good at capitalism. Yes. They were very good at a particular kind of capitalism. They were exceptionally productive farmers. And I do think I'm never going to get tired of seeing pictures of Ukrainian farmers with their tractors towing Russian tanks and armour behind them. Right. But that was one of the reasons why they were persecuted, is because they were exceptionally good productive farmers, and many of them became wealthy. They were called kulaks, and they were exterminated.
Right. It's a fascinating country. There's no question about that. Helen, fascinating insight from you as well on that. Thank you very much indeed. We're out of time, sadly. We'll speak to Helen Dale again shortly. She's got a massive knowledge of Ukraine. Follow her on Twitter. Check out what she's been writing about, what she's been doing as well. We've got much more to do. We'll be talking to